The streets of ancient Rome breathe with life. Oil lamps flicker along narrow lanes, casting warm light upon plastered walls. The scent of bread drifts from hidden courtyards, mingling with the faint smoke of incense rising from temples. Above it all, marble columns stand pale in the moonlight, silent guardians of a restless city. Here, amid ambition and intrigue, a child is born into an old but modest family, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar. No one could yet know that his footsteps would one day echo through the ages, carrying both the weight of glory and the shadow of betrayal. What does it mean for a single life to hold the fate of an entire world? Before we begin, I invite you to gently tap like if stories of the past help you rest, and subscribe so you'll always have another tale waiting when night returns. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and step softly with me into the heart of Rome. In the year 100 BCE, in a modest Roman neighborhood not far from the Forum, a child was born into a family that carried an old name but little wealth. His parents gave him the name Gaius Julius Caesar. It was a name that carried echoes of nobility. Yet the streets outside his home spoke more of dust and clamour than of riches. The young Caesar's family belonged to the patrician class, but theirs was not the world of towering villas and endless banquets. Instead, their house was simple, with plastered walls and the scent of olive oil lamps lingering at night. His mother, Aurelia, was a woman of quiet strength, gentle in her ways but steadfast in her care. His father, also named Gaius Julius, served in political offices of modest rank, guiding the boy with measured words about honour, duty and ambition. Rome itself was alive all around him, restless and unsteady. The city streets echoed with the creak of wooden carts, the neighing of horses, and the laughter of vendors selling figs and honey. Public baths sent up clouds of steam, while temples dedicated to ancient gods watched silently over the city, their marble steps warmed by the sun. Yet beneath this surface of daily life, Rome trembled with tension. Power was concentrated in the hands of the Senate, but old traditions were beginning to clash with the voices of reformers. Political rivalries spilled into the streets, and for a child growing up in such a city, whispers of unrest became part of daily background noise. As a boy, Caesar learned quickly to observe. He would watch senators in their white togas move with dignity through crowded forums, their sandals brushing softly against the stones. He noticed how people gathered around them, listening for promises of grain, land, or protection. These sights planted seeds within him, a fascination with leadership, with the way words could move crowds as surely as soldiers. At home, his mother instilled in him discipline and care. Aurelia's presence was steady, ensuring that Caesar's education was not neglected. He studied language, rhetoric, and history, often by lamplight when the city outside grew quiet. He traced the victories of past generals and recited lines from poets who celebrated Rome's greatness. It was during these quiet lessons that he began to sense that his own life might stretch beyond the narrow walls of his family home. But Caesar's early years were not marked only by study. The games of Roman children filled his days as well. He would run through dusty courtyards with other boys, wooden swords in hand, their shouts echoing against stone walls. They played at battles and triumphs, mimicking the triumphal processions they had seen winding through the city. Generals returning from war, crowned with laurel, followed by the spoils of distant lands. Even in play, Caesar's eyes shone with intensity, as though he was rehearsing for something greater. Outside his home, Rome was a city of contradictions. The smell of fresh bread baking mixed with the harsher odours of crowded streets. Wealthy citizens reclined in lush gardens, listening to the trickle of fountains, while just beyond their walls, the poor slept in cramped tenements. Caesar's young eyes took in these contrasts: privilege and poverty, order and unrest. Perhaps even then, he began to understand that Rome was both fragile and powerful, a place where fortune could shift as quickly as the tides of the Tiber River. As he grew, Caesar's family emphasized the importance of ancestry. He was taught that they claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, through her son Aeneas, the legendary hero of Troy. Though their family held little real power at the time, this story became a quiet flame in Caesar's imagination. To believe he carried divine blood was to believe that his destiny could not be ordinary. But the world around him was turbulent. Rome's politics grew ever more unstable, and clashes between factions turned deadly. When Caesar was still young, his uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, rose to prominence as a general and statesman. Marius was a reformer, beloved by many common citizens, but feared by the Senate. His presence tied Caesar's family to the shifting tides of political conflict. This connection was both a gift and a danger. For the boy, it meant that stories of power and reform filled family gatherings. But it also meant that enemies of Marius might one day become enemies of Caesar. Even as a child, he could feel that belonging to a great family was both shield and burden. As years passed, Caesar began to show signs of determination that seemed beyond his age. He studied oratory with unusual passion, shaping words until they carried weight and rhythm. He walked the streets not just as a boy at play, but as one who measured the height of columns, the bustle of markets, the power of gatherings. The city was his classroom, and every sound, the distant toll of a temple bell, the chants of crowds, became part of his education. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he might have lain awake in his modest chamber, the glow of the moon falling across the floor, hearing the muffled noises of Rome outside. Did he dream then of battles yet to come, of speeches that would stir men's hearts, of laurel wreaths placed upon his brow? No one can know for certain. But history shows us that even in childhood, Caesar carried an intensity that would one day reshape the world. The boy's world was not without its comforts. Festivals brightened the year, Saturnalia with its lights and laughter, processions that filled the streets with music, sacrifices where incense drifted skyward. These moments offered him joy, grounding him in the traditions of Rome, traditions that would one day both guide and bind him. Through all this, Aurelia remained his anchor. She taught him not just to learn, but to endure. Her lessons were woven with gentleness, patience in difficulty, humility in success, and the quiet knowledge that greatness requires both discipline and grace. Her influence would remain with him long after childhood ended, shaping his choices in subtle ways. By the time Caesar reached his teenage years, Rome itself was shifting beneath his feet. Political tempests grew louder, factions quarreled with violence, leaders rose and fell with startling speed. And Caesar, though still a youth, was already being prepared. Through family ties, through education, through the restless spirit that drove him, for the storms to come. The marble of the city gleamed in the sun by day, and cooled beneath the stars by night, as though Rome itself was waiting for the boy who walked its streets to one day step forward, not as a child, but as a man who would claim its destiny. And so, the story of Julius Caesar begins not with crowns or triumphs, but with the quiet rhythm of childhood, the lessons of a devoted mother, the games of dusty courtyards, the whispers of politics, and the dreams of a boy who carried in his name both the weight of history and the promise of the future. The boy who had once run through Rome's courtyards with wooden swords soon grew taller, his features sharpening, his eyes carrying a brightness that seemed to search always for more. Caesar's youth unfolded during a time when Rome itself felt caught between old traditions and new ambitions, like a great ship rocking against unsettled tides. Rome was no longer the small republic of earlier centuries. Its armies had marched far, returning with treasures, new lands, and countless slaves. Yet with expansion came unrest. The gap between the wealthy elite and the common citizens widened, and voices demanding reform grew louder. In this uneasy climate, Caesar's family name became both an anchor and a weight. His uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, was one of the most celebrated generals of the age. To Caesar, Marius must have seemed larger than life, a man who had risen from humble origins to command legions and reshape the army itself. Stories of his victories filled the air at family gatherings, and the young Caesar listened intently, his imagination lit with the idea of what a single man's will might achieve. Yet admiration came with danger. Marius's reforms, which opened military service to poorer citizens, won him the love of the people, but earned him bitter enemies among Rome's ruling elite. Those rivalries would one day spill into open conflict, and young Caesar, bound by blood, would find himself caught in their storm. As a youth, Caesar received an education befitting a Roman noble. His tutors guided him through the art of rhetoric, teaching him how to shape words like a craftsman shaping stone. He learned the power of persuasion, how the rise and fall of a voice could command attention, how a carefully chosen pause could carry more weight than a flood of sentences. To those who heard him practice, there was already something compelling in his presence, as though his words carried a spark that could not easily be ignored. Beyond his studies, Caesar began to walk more purposefully through the city's heart. The Forum, with its columns and bustling crowds, was no longer just a place of play. It became a living stage where he observed senators debating laws, advocates pleading cases, and orators swaying the minds of gathered listeners. He absorbed the rhythms of public life, the rustle of togas, the rise of voices against the backdrop of temple bells, the shifting expressions of crowds moved by argument or promise. Rome itself seemed to whisper lessons. The mosaics in patrician homes told tales of gods and heroes. The graffiti on alley walls spoke of the common people's frustrations. Even the Tiber, flowing steadily through the city, reminded him of constancy amid change. In such an environment, Caesar's mind grew restless, always reaching, always seeking the shape of what his future might hold. But his family's fortunes remained modest. Though they bore the proud Julian name, they did not possess the vast estates or overflowing treasuries of other noble houses. This reality sharpened Caesar's awareness. He would need to carve his path, not by inherited wealth, but by talent, courage, and the strength of alliances. During his teenage years, Caesar began to step into the social circles of Rome's young elites. He attended gatherings where laughter mingled with the sound of wine cups clinking, where youths debated philosophy, boasted of their family lineages, and speculated about who among them would rise to greatness. Caesar often stood out, not for wealth, but for the confidence with which he carried himself. His words were measured yet bold, hinting at an ambition that set him apart. The city around him was filled with contrasts. On one side, glittering villas opened onto courtyards where fountains trickled softly, shaded by olive trees. On the other, the crowded Subura district overflowed with tenements where families lived in cramped rooms, their days marked by the cries of street vendors and the clang of blacksmiths. Caesar walked between these worlds, aware of their differences, sensing that Rome's strength and its tension came from the meeting of these extremes. As he grew older, Rome's political struggles deepened. Factions hardened into two camps: the Optimates, defenders of traditional senatorial power, and the Populares, reformers who sought to extend rights and opportunities to the common people. Caesar's ties to Marius placed him naturally closer to the Populares, but in these years he mostly observed, quietly learning how alliances were forged and how swiftly they could be broken. There were moments of quiet reflection too. One can imagine the young Caesar walking along the Tiber at dusk, the water turning gold under the fading sun, thinking of the world beyond the city. He would have heard travelers speak of distant provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, lands where Roman soldiers marched and Roman governors ruled. Perhaps he wondered even then if he might one day command legions in those far places, carving his name into their histories. At home, Aurelia remained a steady influence. She guided her son with firm affection, urging him toward discipline and self-control. She taught him to listen before he spoke, to carry himself with dignity, and to understand that ambition without restraint could consume a man. Under her watchful eye, Caesar grew not only in intellect, but in poise, yet the city's turbulence crept ever closer. Political violence flared, and rival factions turned to intimidation and bloodshed. The streets of Rome sometimes echoed not with children's games or merchants' calls, but with the clash of mobs and the cries of the wounded. For Caesar, these were sobering lessons. That power was never gentle, that Rome's glory was built on struggle as much as on law. Still, amid this unrest, moments of ordinary beauty remained. Festivals continued to brighten the calendar: the Saturnalia, with its gifts and laughter, the Lupercalia, with its rituals in honor of fertility and spring. Caesar, like other youths, joined in these traditions, carried along by music, torches, and the excitement of crowds gathered under starlit skies. Even as politics cast shadows, Rome's spirit endured in these celebrations, binding its people together through shared custom. By his late teens, Caesar had begun to step more boldly into public life. His speeches at small gatherings hinted at his growing skill, his confidence striking for one so young. He spoke with conviction, weaving reason and passion together, leaving listeners with the sense that he was destined for more than a quiet life. But destiny was not his alone to shape. The rivalry between Marius and his adversary Sulla soon escalated into open conflict, pulling all of Rome into its wake. For young Caesar, the time of mere observation was nearing its end. The city that had been his classroom would soon become a battleground of loyalties, and he, though still barely a man, would be forced to choose where he stood. The marble temples still gleamed, the markets still bustled, and the Tiber still flowed, but beneath the surface, Rome braced for storms, and in those gathering shadows, the youth named Julius Caesar prepared, knowingly or not, to step into history's unfolding drama. The city of Rome stirred with tension as Julius Caesar entered his early manhood. He was no longer the wide-eyed boy trailing after tutors or playing at battles in the courtyards. His shoulders had broadened, his voice had deepened, and his gaze carried the steady confidence of one preparing to step into the wider world. Yet Rome, ever restless, was about to test him with choices that would shape the entire course of his life. By tradition, the path of a Roman nobleman followed a sequence of public offices known as the cursus honorum. It was a ladder of politics and service, one rung after another, climbing from minor posts toward the grand offices of consul and beyond. Caesar, born into an ancient patrician family, was expected to walk that path. But his family's modest means meant that his ascent would not be smoothed by wealth. He would need to rely on talent, alliances, and sheer determination. The first of those alliances came through marriage. At a young age, Caesar was wed to Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a leader aligned with the populares and a close ally of Caesar's uncle Marius. The union was not merely personal, it was political, binding Caesar more firmly to the reformist faction in Rome's turbulent landscape. Cornelia, gentle yet strong, became his companion in these uncertain years, a source of stability amid the storms that swirled around their family. But storms soon broke with violence. When Caesar was barely 20, the general Lucius Cornelius Sulla seized power after a bloody civil war. Sulla represented the optimates, defenders of the Senate's authority, and he looked with suspicion upon all who had ties to Marius or Cinna. Caesar, as Cinna's son-in-law, stood directly in the line of danger. Sulla ordered him to divorce Cornelia. It was a test, a demand that Caesar renounce his political ties and bend to the will of the dictator. Many advised him to comply. To refuse was to risk his life, for Sulla's purges claimed countless victims. But Caesar, though young, stood firm. He would not set aside his wife, not for safety, not for ambition, not for fear. This defiance nearly cost him everything. Stripped of his priesthood, deprived of inheritance, and hunted by Sulla's men, Caesar was forced into hiding. One can imagine him slipping quietly through shadowed streets at night, taking refuge with friends who dared to protect him, always listening for the sound of soldiers at the door. His life hung by a thread. Yet somehow, through a mixture of luck, loyal allies, and perhaps the intervention of influential family connections, he was spared. Sulla, weary of those pleading for Caesar's life, is said to have relented at last, but not without a warning. "In this Caesar," he reportedly declared, "there are many Mariuses." It was a remark heavy with foreboding, as though the young man's spirit already hinted at a future too bold to ignore. Freed from immediate danger, Caesar chose not to remain idle in Rome. Instead, he turned outward, seeking safety and purpose in military service. He joined campaigns in Asia, serving with distinction under Roman commanders. In the dust and heat of foreign lands, far from the marble temples of Rome, Caesar began to shape himself into more than a survivor. He learned the discipline of the camp, the endurance of the march, the weight of command. There is a story told of one early moment that revealed his daring. Captured by pirates while sailing the Aegean, Caesar remained calm, almost amused. He joked with his captors, even insisting they raise his ransom, declaring that he was worth more than they demanded. During his captivity, he recited poems and speeches to them, promising, half in jest, half in truth, that when freed, he would return to punish them. True to his word, once ransomed, he raised a small force, pursued the pirates, and captured them. Yet rather than relish vengeance with cruelty, he carried out justice swiftly, as Roman custom demanded, proving both his resolve and his adherence to Roman law. Such experiences tempered him. They revealed a young man who could face danger without trembling, who carried himself with a composure that unsettled those who underestimated him. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar was no longer simply the nephew of Marius or the son-in-law of Cinna. He was becoming his own figure, tested, resilient, and ready to carve his path. In Rome, he began the early steps of political life. He spoke at trials, sharpening his skills in oratory. Listeners were struck not only by his eloquence, but by his intensity. His voice was not the thunder of a soldier, but the clear, steady tone of one who believed utterly in his cause. His words flowed with rhythm, lifting and carrying the thoughts of his audience, persuading them as though by gentle tide. Even in these early years, Caesar showed a gift for connecting with the common people. He walked among them, listened to their grievances, and spoke in terms they could understand. To many, he seemed less distant than other nobles. He wore his dignity with ease, yet he carried himself as though he belonged not just to the Senate, but to Rome itself. Cornelia remained at his side, a quiet presence amid his rising activity. Their home, though modest compared to those of wealthier patricians, was filled with warmth. Together they shared the joys and sorrows of young marriage, bound not only by love but by shared trials. When their daughter Julia was born, Caesar held her as both father and statesman, seeing in her a continuation of his family line, a thread that bound past, present, and future. But life was not without sorrow. Cornelia's health faltered, and not long after Julia's birth, she passed away. Caesar mourned deeply. At her funeral, he delivered a public eulogy, breaking with tradition by praising not only her lineage, but her personal virtues. It was an act that revealed his courage to defy convention, but also his devotion to those he loved. The people listened, moved by his sincerity. Through grief, Caesar's voice carried a strength that would one day echo across Rome. As the years unfolded, Caesar continued to weave his way into the fabric of Roman politics. He sought offices, supported by those who saw in him both promise and resilience. His style was distinctive, gracious to allies, patient with rivals, yet always steady in pursuit of his goals. He began to master the delicate art of patronage, forming bonds with those who could support his rise. Through it all, his ambition glowed like a quiet flame. He did not rush recklessly, but neither did he shrink from challenges. Each step, his defiance of Sulla, his campaigns abroad, his speeches in the courts, his presence among the people, became a stone in the foundation of a path that led ever upward. Rome in these years remained a city of contrasts, temples gleaming under the sun, streets alive with merchants and philosophers, yet shadows cast by political rivalries that could erupt at any moment. Caesar, moving among senators, soldiers, and citizens alike, seemed to absorb it all, the grandeur and the turmoil, the fragility and the strength. And so the young man, who once risked everything to protect his marriage, now stood at the threshold of something greater. His ambition had awakened, steady and sure, guiding him toward a future in which his name would no longer be spoken as a mere descendant of an old line, but as one destined to leave an indelible mark upon Rome itself. The marble columns of the Forum stood silent witnesses as he took his first steps into politics, each stride echoing with a promise that the boy who had survived danger, the man who had faced pirates and grief, was ready to ascend the ladder of power, one rung at a time. The city of Rome was a place of shifting sands. Friends could become rivals, and rivals could become allies overnight, all bound together in a web of ambition and necessity. Into this world of calculation and intrigue, Julius Caesar stepped with a calm determination, his eyes fixed firmly on the long road ahead. After the loss of his beloved Cornelia, Caesar carried himself with a new gravity. His grief had been public, his devotion to her remembered, and in that sorrow he had earned both sympathy and respect. Yet he was still a young man, and Rome demanded more of him. To survive in its political storms, he would need wealth, allies, and the ability to weave his ambition through the fabric of the Republic. Step by step, he began his climb. He served as a military tribune, gaining valuable experience in command. He was elected quaestor, one of the junior magistracies that marked the beginning of a public career. Each post carried with it not just responsibility, but visibility. Opportunities to prove his skill, his generosity, and his ability to connect with people. Caesar's generosity became one of his defining traits. Though he lacked the great estates of other nobles, he spent freely from what he had, hosting games and spectacles that won him the affection of the common people. Crowds cheered his name, their voices rising above the music of trumpets and the roar of wild beasts in the arena. To them, he was not just another patrician, but a man who gave back, who seemed to carry their hopes with him. This connection with the people brought him into sharp contrast with others in power, but it also drew the attention of those who recognized his potential. Among them were two of the most powerful men in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. Crassus was renowned for his immense wealth. His estates stretched across Rome, and his fortune was so vast that he could fund entire armies. He had made his riches not only through property, but also through shrewd and sometimes ruthless ventures. Yet despite his wealth, Crassus longed for influence and respect equal to his fortune. Pompey, by contrast, was the golden general of Rome. He had won victories across the Mediterranean, clearing the seas of pirates and conquering distant lands. His soldiers adored him. His name carried weight in every forum, and his face was etched with the confidence of one who had been hailed as a hero since his youth. Yet for all their power, both men faced obstacles. The Senate feared Pompey's popularity and resisted granting him further authority. Crassus, though wealthy, lacked the public love that Pompey enjoyed. And Caesar, still rising, needed both resources and protection to continue his ascent. It was in this triangle of ambition that an unlikely alliance formed, the arrangement history remembers as the First Triumvirate. The seeds of this partnership were planted quietly, in conversations carried out behind closed doors, away from the echoing marble halls of the Senate. Caesar, ever perceptive, saw that by uniting Crassus and Pompey, he could create a balance that would benefit them all. Crassus's wealth, Pompey's armies, and Caesar's popularity with the people formed a triad of strength too great for the Senate to resist. When the three men came to terms, it was less a friendship than a pact of necessity. Each would support the other's ambitions. Each would give and receive in turn. And through this alliance, Caesar secured the backing he needed to achieve one of the highest offices of the Republic, the consulship. In the year 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul, the highest magistracy in Rome. His triumph was not just his own, it was the fruit of careful negotiation, of promises given and debts accepted. With Crassus and Pompey behind him, Caesar entered office not as a solitary figure, but as the third pillar of an unspoken yet undeniable power. As consul, Caesar governed with both firmness and flair. He proposed laws that granted land to veterans and provided relief to the poor, measures that won him lasting favor among the people. His speeches rang through the forum, his voice steady and persuasive, weaving images of justice and prosperity. Supporters pressed forward to hear him, the smell of dust and sweat mingling with the sweetness of incense rising from nearby temples. But the Senate, wary of his growing influence, resisted him at every turn. Meetings became battlegrounds of words, with senators hurling accusations and Caesar answering with calm conviction. At times, the atmosphere grew so heated that proceedings collapsed into shouting, the marble walls reverberating with anger. Yet Caesar pressed on, his determination unshaken. His bond with Pompey was strengthened through marriage, as Caesar gave his daughter Julia to Pompey as wife. Their union, far from being merely political, blossomed into genuine affection. Julia's presence softened Pompey's stern nature, and the bond between father-in-law and son-in-law grew strong, further anchoring the alliance. Meanwhile, Caesar also drew on Crassus's wealth to fund his ambitious projects. Lavish games and public works filled Rome with excitement, the people marveling at their consul's generosity. To ordinary citizens, Caesar seemed less like a distant ruler and more like a champion of their daily lives. Yet beneath the surface, tensions remained. The Triumvirate was strong, but fragile. Each man carried his own ambitions, and trust among them was thin. Caesar, however, managed to hold the balance, his charm and political skill keeping the alliance intact. At the close of his consulship, Caesar faced the question of what came next. A year in office was fleeting. To secure his future, he needed a command that would extend his reach and his reputation. With the support of his allies, he secured a proconsular command over Gaul, a vast and unsettled region stretching beyond the Alps. To many senators, this seemed a convenient exile, a way to remove Caesar from the daily life of Rome. Yet to Caesar, it was an opportunity beyond measure. In Gaul, he would find not just a post, but a stage vast enough to display his genius, to prove himself as soldier and general, and to build the kind of power that could rival any man in Rome. As he prepared to leave the city, the streets buzzed with speculation. Citizens watched him depart, some cheering, others wary, all aware that his journey marked a turning point. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, uncertain of what this ambitious man might achieve beyond its borders. Caesar walked among his soldiers with calm authority, his cloak brushing softly against the dust of the road. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks misted in the distance, and beyond them lay Gaul, a land of forests, rivers, and tribes that Rome had never fully subdued. The forum behind him, the Senate divided, his allies waiting, and his enemies watching. Caesar set his eyes on the horizon. The alliance he had forged in Rome had given him his command. Now, His destiny would be tested not in debate or law, but in the clash of arms and the march of legions. And so began the next chapter of his life, one that would carry him far from the marble temples of his youth, into the wilderness of foreign lands, where his ambition would burn brighter than ever, and where the measure of his greatness would be tested against the vast expanse of Gaul. The morning mist clung to the valleys as Caesar rode at the head of his column. Behind him stretched a line of soldiers, their sandals striking rhythm against the packed earth, their shields glinting faintly in the pale light. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, so different from the warm dust of Rome. Ahead lay Gaul, vast, untamed, and filled with both opportunity and danger. When Caesar first crossed into Gaul, few could have imagined the scale of what was to come. For the Senate, it was merely a proconsular command, a chance to keep him occupied far from the intrigues of the city. But for Caesar, it was a stage wide enough to test his courage, his discipline, and the loyalty of his legions. Gaul was no single nation, but a tapestry of tribes, each with its own chiefs, warriors, and traditions. Some traded with Rome, others resisted its encroachment fiercely. To the Roman mind, it was a land of forests stretching beyond sight, rivers that cut through fertile plains, and tribes that seemed as unpredictable as the winds. To Caesar, it was both challenge and canvas, upon which he might paint his own greatness. His first campaigns were swift and decisive. With a clarity of purpose, Caesar moved against tribes that threatened Roman allies, scattering them with the precision of a commander who already thought several steps ahead. His soldiers, though weary from long marches, began to see in him not just a politician turned general, but a leader who shared their burdens. He marched with them, ate their rations, and endured the same rains that soaked their cloaks at night. Around the campfires, the men spoke of his energy, his sleeplessness, his ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. For them, Caesar became more than a commander. He became a figure of unshakable confidence, one whose presence steadied them in moments of uncertainty. The land itself became part of the story. Dense forests closed in with shadows and bird call, rivers rushed cold and swift, and wide plains stretched beneath skies heavy with clouds. Each new campaign carried the legions deeper into this landscape, and each victory bound them tighter to their general. Word of Caesar's successes travelled quickly back to Rome. Reports arrived of battles won, of tribes subdued, of fortresses taken. The Senate listened with unease, for every victory added to Caesar's reputation. Every triumph made him harder to dismiss. The people, however, thrilled to the stories. To them, Caesar was not just governing abroad, he was expanding Rome's glory, bringing its power to lands that had long resisted its reach. One of the most striking episodes came with the confrontation against the Helvetii, a tribe that sought to migrate through Roman territory. Their numbers were vast, their movement threatening to destabilize the entire region. Caesar, with careful planning, blocked their path. In the battles that followed, he demonstrated his gift for strategy, dividing his forces with precision, outmaneuvering larger numbers, and striking at the moment of greatest advantage. When the dust settled, the Helvetii were defeated, their migration halted, their leaders compelled to negotiate. Yet Gaul was far from subdued. The Germanic tribes, under their chieftain Ariovistus, posed another formidable challenge. Fierce and unyielding, Ariovistus had carved out a presence that alarmed both the Gauls and Rome. Caesar confronted him with boldness. meeting him in tense negotiations before battle erupted. The clash was fierce, but once again, Caesar's discipline and foresight carried the day. Ariovistus was driven back across the Rhine, and the legions rejoiced, their confidence in their commander deepening further still. As the years unfolded, Caesar's campaigns grew larger, more complex. Fortresses rose and fell, alliances shifted like sand, and tribes that had once resisted Rome now sought its friendship. The legions built bridges across rivers, roads through forests, and camps that seemed to spring up overnight, their orderliness a testament to Roman discipline. And at the center of it all was Caesar, tireless, calculating, yet also deeply attentive to the morale of his men. In the evenings, as soldiers gathered around fires, their armor set aside and the smell of stew drifting through the camp, Caesar would walk among them. He spoke with them, remembered names, listened to their concerns. These simple gestures bound him to his men in ways that gold or rank could not. The legions began to call themselves not merely soldiers of Rome, but soldiers of Caesar. Beyond the Rhine, the Germanic tribes still watched. Across the Channel, the misty shores of Britain beckoned, unknown and mysterious. Caesar, restless in his ambition, turned even toward those distant lands. His expeditions into Britain, though brief and challenging, captured the imagination of Rome. For the first time, Roman standards touched the island's soil, and Caesar returned with tales of strange customs and painted warriors. Though not a conquest, it was a gesture of audacity, a sign that his ambition reached even beyond the known world. But Gaul was not merely a string of victories. Resistance flared again and again, culminating in the rise of a leader who would test Caesar as none had before, Vercingetorix, the chieftain of the Arverni. Charismatic and determined, Vercingetorix united tribes that had long been divided, forging them into a coalition strong enough to challenge Rome's hold. The struggle against Vercingetorix was fierce, marked by sieges and counterattacks, by fire and famine. The Gauls fought with passion born of defending their homeland, while Caesar pressed forward with unrelenting resolve. The climax came at the fortress of Alesia, where Caesar's genius for engineering and strategy shone brightest. Surrounded by the Gauls within and threatened by relief armies without, Caesar ordered his men to build two immense walls, one encircling the enemy, the other protecting the Romans from outside attack. Day after day, the soldiers labored, their hands blistered, their bodies weary, yet their trust in Caesar never wavered. When the final assaults came, the legions held firm, and the Gauls were crushed. Vercingetorix, noble in defeat, laid down his arms at Caesar's feet, a symbol of Gaul's submission. With Alesia, Caesar secured his place as one of history's greatest commanders. The conquest of Gaul was not complete in a single battle, but Alesia marked the turning point, the moment when resistance collapsed and Rome's dominion spread across the region. For Caesar, the rewards were immense. He returned to winter camps not as a mere proconsul, but as a conqueror, his name carried on the lips of his soldiers with reverence. In Rome, his reports, carefully crafted and widely circulated, thrilled the people. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear, unadorned language, told of victories and hardships alike, drawing readers into the marches and battles as though they themselves had stood beneath the Roman standards. The Senate, however, grew increasingly uneasy. Each victory, each triumph, each cheer from the people strengthened Caesar's hand. He was no longer the young politician who had once needed allies to climb the ladder of office. He had become something more formidable, a general with the loyalty of entire legions, and a reputation that rivaled the greatest names of Rome. And yet, amid the triumphs, Caesar never lost his measured composure. He marched steadily, wrote clearly, spoke persuasively. He carried himself not with the bluster of arrogance, but with the quiet assurance of one who believed destiny walked beside him. The rivers of Gaul continued to flow, the forests continued to whisper with wind, but the land was changed forever. Rome had extended its reach, and Caesar had carved his name into its story with iron and will. As winter snows settled over the hills, and soldiers huddled in camps warmed by fire, Caesar's thoughts turned southward. Rome awaited. There, in the marble halls of the Senate, envy and suspicion sharpened like blades. His victories in Gaul had given him power beyond measure, but power in Rome was never held without cost. The conquest was complete, yet for Caesar, the true battles were only beginning. The snows of Gaul had melted into spring when Caesar at last turned his gaze southward. Behind him lay years of conquest, battles fought across forests and rivers, alliances won and lost, the final surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia. Ahead lay Rome, the city of marble and dust, where applause and suspicion waited in equal measure. News of his victories had long since reached the capital. The people spoke his name with admiration, repeating tales from his commentaries. They imagined the thunder of his legions, the gleam of standards in foreign skies, the courage of the general who had led Rome into lands few had ever seen. To them, Caesar was not just a governor abroad. He was the embodiment of Rome's greatness, extending its shadow farther than ever before. When he returned, the city prepared itself for spectacle. Triumphal processions wound through the streets, their routes lined with cheering crowds. The sound of trumpets and drums echoed off stone walls, while garlands of flowers hung from balconies. Soldiers carried spoils of war, gold, weapons, exotic animals, and behind them came the captives of distant lands, their faces solemn as they walked beneath the gaze of thousands. At the heart of it all rode Caesar. Draped in a purple cloak, crowned with laurel, he sat tall upon his chariot. The air was filled with acclamations. I triumph! Io triumph! Children waved branches, women cast flowers into the road, men shouted praises that rose like a tide. To many, it seemed that Rome itself bent toward him in gratitude. Yet even amid the jubilation, there were murmurs. Some senators watched the processions with unease, their brows furrowed beneath the shadow of suspicion. Triumphs, they knew, were not merely celebrations. They were declarations of power. And Caesar's power was no longer something the Senate could easily contain. Still, in public, he moved with dignity, never boastful, never careless. His speeches were measured, his gestures deliberate. He reminded the people that his victories belonged not to him alone, but to Rome, to its gods, its traditions, its destiny. And the people, hearing his words, loved him all the more. Among those who watched most closely was Pompey, once Caesar's ally, bound by marriage to his daughter Julia. Pompey had shared in the power of the Triumvirate. But Julia had died, and with her passing, the personal bond between the two men dissolved into memory. Pompey, the seasoned general, saw in Caesar not a partner, but a rival, one whose victories threatened to outshine his own. The Senate, wary of Caesar's growing influence, leaned increasingly upon Pompey. They courted him with honours, seeking in him a counterweight to the conqueror of Gaul. Pompey, dignified and cautious, accepted their embrace, even as the seeds of rivalry with Caesar began to take root. Caesar, for his part, sought to secure his position. He proposed land reforms, easing the burdens of the poor. He called for veterans to be honoured and rewarded. In every measure, he appealed directly to the people, bypassing the Senate's resistance. The crowds filled the forum to hear him, their voices rising in approval, their loyalty to him deepening. Yet the Senate grew ever more hostile. They demanded that Caesar relinquish his command, that he return to Rome not as a general with legions at his back, but as a private citizen, stripped of immunity. For Caesar, this was no simple request. It was a demand that he place his life in their hands, trusting the very men who feared and resented him. The choice before him was stark. To surrender his command was to risk prosecution, exile, perhaps even death. To hold on to it was to defy the Senate, to invite confrontation, to set himself against the traditions of the Republic itself. The city grew tense. Conversations in taverns and marketplaces turned towards speculation. Would Caesar submit? Would Pompey oppose him? The streets buzzed with rumour, even as daily life continued. Bakers kneaded dough. Children played in courtyards. The Tiber flowed steady and calm. Yet beneath the surface, Rome braced itself for conflict. Amid this tension, Caesar remained composed. He spoke of duty, of justice, of loyalty to the people. He reminded his supporters that his victories had not been for himself, but for Rome. Yet in private, he measured his steps carefully, weighing every option, every consequence. The bond between Caesar and his soldiers grew all the stronger in these days. They had marched with him through mud and snow, through battles and sieges, and their loyalty was unshakable. To them, Caesar was not merely a commander. He was a leader who had shared their hardships, who had rewarded their courage, who had made them part of Rome's glory. They would follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself. Pompey, meanwhile, stood at the heart of the Senate's plans. His authority was reaffirmed, his influence reinforced. He raised troops in Italy, preparing for the possibility of civil war. To some, it seemed as though Rome itself was dividing, one half looking to Caesar, the other to Pompey. And still, Caesar hesitated at the threshold of decision. He longed for reconciliation, for a path that would allow him to retain his dignity without plunging the Republic into war. Letters passed, envoys spoke, but the Senate's demands remained firm. He must lay down his command before he entered Rome. In the quiet of his camp, Caesar reflected on the choice. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine from distant forests. His soldiers rested around fires, their voices drifting into the dark. Beyond them, the stars spread across the sky, silent witnesses to the weight upon their general's shoulders. Was it ambition that guided him, or necessity? Did he seek to preserve his own life, or to protect the cause of the people who cheered his name? Perhaps it was both. For Caesar, the personal and the political had always been intertwined, bound together like threads in a single tapestry. And so the conqueror of Gaul, the celebrated general, the beloved champion of the people, stood on the edge of a decision that would change Rome forever. Behind him lay triumphs and glory. Before him lay uncertainty, conflict, and the possibility of ruin. The Forum still rang with the echoes of his victories. The Senate still whispered of his ambition. Pompey still watched, wary and determined, and Caesar himself, calm and resolute, prepared to take the step that would turn triumph into destiny. The Tiber flowed quietly through the heart of Rome, its waters reflecting the moonlight. Yet far to the north, another river waited, a river that marked the boundary between command and surrender, between peace and war, between the Republic as it had been and whatever it was about to become. Soon Caesar would stand at its banks. The winter air hung cold and still as Caesar's legions marched southward. Their cloaks were drawn tight, their breath rising in pale clouds as they trod along the frozen roads of northern Italy. Behind them lay Gaul, conquered, subdued, a land that had crowned their general with glory. Ahead lay Rome, its marble temples gleaming faintly in their thoughts, its senate halls echoing with arguments and decrees. At the heart of this march stood Caesar himself, calm upon his horse, his gaze steady upon the horizon. The Senate had made its demand clear. He was to disband his army before entering Italy. To return as a private citizen was to surrender the shield of his command, to place himself in the hands of those who feared and resented him. For Caesar, this was no choice at all. He knew that without the loyalty of his soldiers, without the strength of his legions, he would face prosecution, exile, perhaps even death. And yet, to keep his army with him was to defy the Republic, to march against the authority of the Senate. Between these two paths lay a single boundary, a narrow river known as the Rubicon. The Rubicon itself was no grand barrier. It was a modest stream, its waters flowing quietly through fields and villages, its banks lined with reeds. Farmers led their oxen to drink there. Children skipped stones across its surface. But in Roman law, it marked the sacred divide. To cross it with an army was to declare war upon the Republic. As Caesar approached its banks, the weight of history seemed to gather in the silence around him. His soldiers, weary from their march, waited with a mixture of loyalty and unease. They looked to him, their general, the man who had led them through snow and storm, who had shared their hardships and lifted them to triumph. Would he command them to halt, to lay down their arms and return to obscurity? Or would he lead them across the stream into the unknown? The night was quiet, the air sharp with cold. Caesar dismounted, standing at the water's edge. The current whispered against the stones, as though the river itself knew the gravity of the moment. He paused, gazing upon its surface, his mind no doubt filled with the voices of Rome, the cheers of the people, the warnings of the Senate, the memory of Pompey, once ally, now rival. In that stillness, Caesar weighed the cost. To cross was to bring war to Italy, to risk the ruin of the Republic he claimed to serve. But to turn back was to surrender his destiny, to place his life in the hands of men who had already judged him. At last, he turned to his officers. His voice, though soft, carried through the ranks. He spoke of fate, of duty, of the moment when hesitation must yield to action. The words were not shouted, but steady, like the current before them. Once crossed, there could be no return. And then, with deliberate steps, Caesar waded into the Rubicon. The cold water rose against his sandals, the ripples spreading outward as though marking the beginning of a tide. His officers followed, and then his soldiers, one after another, until the entire column was moving, the sound of splashing water breaking the silence of the night. So it was, that the Rubicon was crossed, not with the thunder of battle, but with the quiet resolve of men walking steadily into history. When the army reached the far bank, a murmur rippled through the ranks. The step had been taken. The die, as Caesar himself is said to have declared, was cast. From that moment, the march southward carried a different weight. Villages watched with awe as the legions passed, their standards glinting in the pale light. Some citizens cheered, others hid in fear, but all knew that Rome itself trembled at the advance of its most daring son. Word travelled quickly to the capital. Senators fled in panic, fearing what might come. Pompey, entrusted with defending the Republic, gathered his forces and withdrew, unwilling to risk immediate battle against Caesar's hardened legions. The city buzzed with confusion. Its marketplaces hushed, its temples filled with anxious prayers. Caesar, however, moved with calm precision. His advance was not one of reckless destruction, but of measured steps. He reassured towns, promised protection, spared those who did not resist. His soldiers, disciplined and loyal, marched as though guided by an invisible rhythm, their presence both feared and admired. To the people, Caesar was no invader. He was their champion, the general they had cheered during triumphs, the man whose generosity had filled their festivals. Crowds gathered to watch him pass, their voices rising in cautious welcome, as though uncertain whether to rejoice or to hold their breath. For Caesar himself, the crossing of the Rubicon was not a moment of triumph, but of inevitability. In his heart, he must have known that Rome could never again be the same. The Republic, fragile and divided, had been brought to a breaking point, and he, with his legions at his side, had chosen to push it beyond return. The journey southward continued, each mile carrying him closer to the heart of power. The roads wound through fields where farmers paused in their labor to watch, through towns where officials offered keys and pledges of loyalty. The winter skies hung low, the air filled with the sound of marching feet, the clink of armor, the steady beat of drums that marked their progress. At night, in camp, the fires flickered against the darkness. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of what lay ahead. Some feared civil war, others dreamed of riches and rewards. Yet all trusted their general. For Caesar, they would march not only to Rome, but to whatever destiny awaited. Meanwhile, Pompey and the Senate regrouped further south. They gathered resources, called upon allies, sought to rally the Republic to their cause. To them, Caesar was a threat not only to tradition, but to freedom itself. And so the stage was set. Two of Rome's greatest men, once bound by alliance, now divided by ambition, preparing to face one another across the fields of Italy. But in this first step, at the banks of a modest river, the course of history had already turned. The Republic's careful balance of power, maintained for centuries, had been broken by the quiet crossing of water beneath the stars. The Rubicon flowed on, its current unchanged, its banks still lined with reeds, its stones still scattered along the bottom. Yet for Rome, the moment could never be undone. The line had been crossed, the die had been cast, and the path ahead led only deeper into the unknown. Caesar, riding at the head of his army, did not look back. His eyes were fixed southward, upon Rome, upon Pompey, upon the destiny that now awaited him. And so, with measured steps and steady hearts, the legions marched on, carrying with them the weight of a republic transformed, the hush of a people watching, and the memory of a river that had marked the boundary between what had been and what was yet to come. The quiet flow of the Rubicon had been left behind, but its ripples reached far and wide. By the time Caesar's legions pressed deeper into Italy, the news of his defiance had spread like wildfire. Markets buzzed with rumors, temples filled with anxious prayers, and senators whispered of a republic unbalanced, its future trembling on a knife's edge. Pompey, entrusted by the Senate with the defense of Rome, found himself unprepared for the speed and decisiveness of Caesar's march. Though he commanded respect as Rome's great general, much of his army was scattered across provinces, his strength not yet gathered. To face Caesar immediately would be to risk everything with unready forces. And so, with the Senate in tow, Pompey withdrew southward, leaving Rome to the approaching legions. Caesar entered the city not as a marauder, but as a man of order. His soldiers marched with discipline, their sandals striking the stones in rhythm, their faces calm beneath polished helmets. To the citizens watching from doorways and balconies, it was not chaos that arrived, but a steady tide led by the man they already admired. He reassured them with promises of safety, sparing homes and markets, sparing temples and shrines. His words carried not threat, but steadiness. Rome was not his enemy, only those who sought to destroy him were. In the Senate's absence, the city felt strangely hollow, as though its heart had fled. Yet the people's lives went on. Bakers kneaded their dough at dawn, children played in courtyards, artisans bent over their work. Above them, banners bearing Caesar's standards fluttered in the breeze, marking a new order quietly taking root. But Caesar knew that Rome was not yet his. To secure his position, he needed to follow Pompey, to confront the man who had once been his ally and now stood as his rival. The struggle was no longer about office or titles. It was about who would hold the republic in their hands. The legions marched southward, their pace unrelenting. Along the way, towns opened their gates willingly, offering food and loyalty. Many remembered Caesar's generosity from his consulship, his voice in the forum, his promises of reform. To them, he was not a usurper, but a protector, a man who carried Rome's destiny upon his shoulders. Pompey, meanwhile, gathered his forces at Brundisium, the great port upon Italy's heel. There, ships waited to carry him and his followers across the Adriatic to Greece, where he could regroup, draw upon allies, and muster strength for the battles to come. As Caesar approached, Pompey's departure grew hurried, his soldiers filing onto ships under the pale light of dawn, sails swelling in the sea breeze. Caesar reached the harbour only to see the last of the ships slipping out to sea, their masts shrinking upon the horizon. The waters shimmered in the sunlight, calm and indifferent, while Caesar stood upon the shore, his cloak stirring in the wind. Pompey had escaped, and with him the war had moved beyond Italy's borders. But even as Pompey fled, Caesar pressed on with characteristic swiftness. He secured the treasury, ensuring the resources to fund his campaign. He reassured the people of Rome, leaving behind stability where others might have sown fear. And then, with only a fraction of his legions, he embarked upon a daring plan to pursue Pompey across the Mediterranean, to strike before his rival could gather too much strength. The sea carried him eastward, its waves rising and falling beneath the Roman ships. The men aboard spoke quietly of what lay ahead, their voices mingling with the creak of wood and the cry of gulls. Across the waters, Greece awaited, a land of marble temples and storied battlefields, now to be the stage of a new struggle. Pompey, meanwhile, gathered allies with ease. The eastern provinces, long loyal to him, rallied to his call. Kings and governors sent supplies, ships, and soldiers. In his camp, the atmosphere swelled with confidence, for he commanded not only numbers, but the legitimacy of the Senate's decrees. To his supporters, Pompey was the defender of the Republic against Caesar's ambition. Caesar, however, advanced with the same unshakable resolve that had carried him through Gaul. He moved swiftly, dividing his forces where needed, striking with precision. His soldiers, hardened by years of campaign, trusted him completely. They marched across foreign fields as though they were extensions of Rome itself, their discipline never faltering, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that their general shared their hardships as always. The contrast between the two camps was stark. Pompey's forces brimmed with numbers but lacked cohesion, drawing men from distant provinces with varied tongues and customs. Caesar's legions were fewer, but united by years of loyalty, bound by bonds forged in mud and blood, in victories shared and hardships endured. As the months unfolded, the conflict stretched across provinces and seas. Skirmishes flared along coasts, cities shifted allegiance, and both sides maneuvered carefully, seeking the advantage that would tilt the balance. The Mediterranean itself seemed alive with the movement of fleets, sails rising like wings against the horizon, their shadows sliding across the waters. In Rome, the people waited, their daily lives marked by uncertainty. They spoke of omens, of dreams, of signs in the skies. Some prayed for Pompey, others for Caesar, but all felt the weight of history pressing upon their shoulders. The republic that had endured for centuries seemed fragile, as though the marble columns of its temples trembled at the footsteps of two men. Through it all, Caesar remained composed. His letters and decrees flowed steadily back to Rome, written in clear language that reminded the people of his vision for justice, order, and prosperity. His presence was felt even in his absence, his name whispered in marketplaces, his face imagined in the flickering lamplight of Roman homes. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any Rome had known, not against foreign kings or distant tribes, but between two of its own, once allies, now divided by ambition. The seas lay between them, their waves rolling endlessly as though marking time until the moment of decision. Caesar stood ready, his legions close at hand, their shields polished, their spirits unwavering. Pompey, across the waters, marshalled his hosts, confident in numbers, in allies, in the Senate's blessing. Between them stretched not only the Adriatic, but the fate of the Republic itself. And so the civil war unfolded, not in one battle, but in a gathering storm of marches and countermarches, of fleets moving like shadows across the sea, of soldiers waiting in camps for the command that would hurl them into destiny. The night skies stretched over both camps, the same stars shining down upon Caesar and Pompey alike. Yet the paths they had chosen diverged, and the Republic could no longer hold them both. Soon their destinies would meet. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath a summer sun as Caesar's ships crossed the waves, their sails taut against the wind. Ahead lay Greece, where Pompey had gathered his forces, armies swollen with recruits from every corner of the Roman world, their camps stretching wide across fertile plains. Caesar, with fewer men but stronger discipline, pressed forward, his eyes steady, his resolve unbroken. The civil war, whispered in forums and debated in temples, was no longer a matter of speculation. It had become reality, and its resolution would be written not in speeches, but in the movement of legions across fields and hills. For months, the two sides maneuvered, circling one another like wary predators. Pompey, confident in his numbers, avoided rash confrontation, waiting for hunger and time to weaken Caesar's smaller army. Caesar, patient as ever, probed, tested, adjusted his plans, seeking the moment when boldness could turn disadvantage into triumph. The landscape of Greece became their chessboard. Valleys echoing with marching feet, hills dotted with watchfires, harbours filled with ships ready to strike or retreat. At night, soldiers on both sides lay beneath the same stars, whispering of omens and futures, of loyalty and fear. Yet among Caesar's men there was little doubt. They trusted the man who had led them through Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon with calm resolve, who shared their food and their hardships without complaint. The confrontation came at last upon the wide plain of Pharsalus, where the rivers wound gently between rolling fields. The air was heavy with anticipation, the morning light casting long shadows as both armies formed their lines. Pompey's host stretched vast and imposing, glittering with armour, banners fluttering in the breeze. Caesar's line was thinner, yet his soldiers stood firm, their faces calm, their eyes fixed on their general. Caesar moved among them before the battle began. He spoke softly, reminding them of their victories together, of the trust they had built across years of march and struggle. His words were not grandiose, but personal. Each man felt that Caesar spoke to him alone, calling him brother, partner, guardian of Rome's honour. When he finished, the soldiers raised their voices, their confidence surging like a wave. The battle itself, though fierce, unfolded with Caesar's characteristic clarity. He held back a reserve of seasoned veterans, hidden from Pompey's view, waiting for the moment when their strike would turn the tide. When Pompey's cavalry charged, Caesar's hidden force rose like a shadow from the dust, meeting them with steady spears, driving them back in confusion. Slowly, then swiftly, Pompey's great army faltered, its strength unravelling before the discipline of Caesar's legions. When the clash was done, the field lay silent, but for the cries of the wounded and the calls of officers rallying their men. Caesar stood victorious. Pompey, once hailed as the greatest general of Rome, fled from the field, his destiny now uncertain. The Republic, so long balanced between rival powers, tilted decisively towards Caesar. Pompey's flight carried him across the sea to Egypt, seeking refuge in a land whose rulers owed their thrones to Rome's favour. But fortune turned against him there. Betrayed by those who sought to win Caesar's approval, Pompey met his end upon a lonely shore, his noble life cut short not by a rival's sword in fair contest, but by treachery. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he turned away in sorrow. Tears filled his eyes for the man who had once been his ally, his son-in-law, his rival. It was not triumph he felt, but grief. Grief for a friend lost to ambition and to the cruelty of fate. Yet even amid mourning, Caesar could not stand still. Egypt itself was in turmoil, its throne contested between young Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra. Drawn into their struggle, Caesar found himself once more at the centre of intrigue. Cleopatra, radiant in her intelligence and charm, sought his support, and together they forged an alliance that bound Rome and Egypt in new ways. Their bond, personal as well as political, would endure, shaping the course of both empires. But Caesar's destiny lay not in Alexandria's gilded halls, but in Rome. With Pompey gone, with the Senate scattered, With his legions loyal and the people eager for stability, Caesar returned westward as the undisputed master of the Republic. When he entered the city, it was not with the harshness of conquest, but with the steadiness of a leader who sought to heal divisions. He proclaimed pardons for many who had opposed him, extending clemency where vengeance might have been expected. His mercy, remarkable in an age when civil wars often ended in blood, won him both admiration and suspicion. Some praised his magnanimity, others whispered that it was only another form of power, binding men to him through gratitude and obligation. The Senate, diminished and wary, granted him extraordinary authority. He was declared dictator, first for a term of months, then for years, and eventually for life. The old rhythms of the Republic, with its balance of offices and annual elections, seemed to fade as Caesar's name rose above all others. Yet he did not wear his authority as a tyrant. Instead, he set about reforming the state. He reorganized the calendar, establishing the system that would endure for centuries as the Julian calendar, aligning days and seasons with a precision that brought order to daily life. He revised laws, restructured debts, and extended citizenship to many across the provinces, weaving Rome's vast domains more tightly together. In the streets, life pulsed with renewed energy. Markets bustled, aqueducts carried fresh water, new buildings rose beneath the bright Italian sun. Citizens, weary of years of uncertainty, welcomed the stability Caesar offered. To them, he was not merely a general or politician, but a visionary who sought to bring Rome into harmony with itself. Yet in the shadows of this vision, unease lingered. Some senators feared that Caesar's power had grown too great, that his clemency was but a mask, that the Republic's very essence was dissolving into the rule of one man. To them, Caesar was no savior, but a monarch in all but name, and Rome, once free, was slipping into bondage. But for the moment, Caesar stood at the height of his power. He had faced Pompey upon the fields of Pharsalus, mourned his passing, secured Egypt through Cleopatra, and returned to Rome not as a fugitive or rebel, but as the man who now held its destiny in his hands. The Forum echoed once more with his speeches, his words carrying calm assurance. The people cheered his name, their voices rising like the tides of the Tiber. Senators, though wary, bowed to his authority. The temples glowed in the sunlight, incense drifting toward the heavens, as though in silent acknowledgement of a new order taking shape. And Caesar himself, the boy once born into a modest patrician household, the youth who had defied Sulla, the general who had conquered Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, now stood as master of Rome. The marble of the city gleamed beneath the sun, the air filled with the hum of daily life. Yet beneath the harmony, questions remained. Could one man carry the weight of the Republic upon his shoulders? Could Caesar's vision bring lasting peace? Or would it stir fears too deep to quiet? For now, the city rested, reassured by his presence. But destiny, like the river he once crossed, still flowed onward, carrying him toward challenges yet unseen. Rome, weary from years of civil war, breathed more steadily under Caesar's return. The clash of rival armies had faded into memory, and in its place came the sound of construction, of planning, of new beginnings. The marble of temples glowed once more in the sunlight, markets bustled with renewed confidence, and the voices of ordinary citizens rang out in the streets with a mixture of relief and curiosity. For Caesar, victory had never been an end in itself. To conquer was to open the way for creation, to use triumph as the foundation for a new order. Now, as master of Rome, he turned from battlefields to reforms, from the clash of steel to the shaping of laws and institutions. The Senate had granted him the title of Dictator, first for limited terms and at last for life. It was a role that carried both immense power and immense expectation. Many feared what such authority might mean, but Caesar wielded it not as a tyrant seizing spoils, but as a leader determined to bring harmony to a republic frayed by decades of conflict. One of his most lasting achievements was the reform of the calendar. For centuries, Rome's days had slipped out of alignment with the seasons, their festivals drifting from their proper times. Caesar, with advice from astronomers, introduced a new system, the Julian calendar. It divided the year with clarity, adding a leap day every 4th year to keep time steady with the sun. With this reform, farmers could sow with confidence, priests could honor festivals correctly, and citizens could feel the rhythm of life restored. Beyond the measurement of days, Caesar sought to ease the burdens of debt. Civil wars had left many struggling, their farms neglected, their incomes disrupted. With careful measures, he reduced the weight of what was owed without destroying the trust of lenders, striking a balance between mercy and order. Families breathed easier, their anxiety softened as the fear of losing homes or fields gave way to stability. He also looked outward, to the provinces scattered across Rome's vast dominion. For too long, these lands had been exploited by governors who enriched themselves at the expense of local peoples. Caesar reformed their administration, curbing corruption, ensuring fairer taxation, and extending the rights of Roman citizenship more broadly. To the provincials, it was as if a distant, often harsh power had suddenly grown attentive and just. To Caesar, it was the weaving of Rome into a single fabric, stronger for its unity. Within the city itself, he initiated grand projects. New buildings rose, their columns gleaming in the sun. Roads were repaired, aqueducts improved, harbors strengthened. The Forum bustled with activity, its stones echoing with the footsteps of citizens who sensed that Rome was entering not decline, but renewal. To walk the streets in those days was to feel the hum of energy, the steady pulse of a city being reborn under guiding hands. Caesar's reforms reached even to the Senate itself. He enlarged its membership, bringing in men from Italy and the provinces, broadening its scope beyond the narrow patrician elite. To some, this was an affront to tradition, diluting the purity of Rome's ruling body. To others, it was a bold recognition that Rome's strength lay not only in the old aristocracy, but in the vast diversity of its dominion. The poor, too, felt the touch of Caesar's vision. He distributed land to veterans who had long served under Roman standards, ensuring their loyalty was rewarded with stability. He founded colonies abroad, offering homes and fields to the landless, turning restless citizens into settled farmers who carried Roman culture into distant lands. For many, it was the chance of a new life, a renewal that tied their fates to Caesar's generosity. Amid these reforms, Caesar carried himself with calm dignity. He wore his honors lightly, appearing in the Forum not as a distant monarch, but as a leader who walked among the people. His speeches, written in clear, direct language, carried a sense of purpose. He spoke not of himself alone, but of Rome, of what it had been, of what it could become, of how it might endure not just through force, but through fairness and foresight. And yet, even as he worked to heal the Republic, murmurs of unease persisted. Some senators, watching their influence wane, feared that Caesar's generosity was but another form of dominance, binding citizens and soldiers alike to him through gratitude. Others whispered that his clemency, remarkable though it was, masked a deeper ambition, that he sought not merely to reform the Republic, but to replace it with something altogether new. Still, in these years, the mood in Rome was largely one of relief. The city, long accustomed to strife, found comfort in the order Caesar provided. Festivals returned with renewed joy, temples filled with incense and song, markets bustled with trade from across the Mediterranean. The Tiber flowed quietly through the city, its waters reflecting a sense of calm that had been absent for decades. Caesar himself did not live only in the realm of laws and decrees. He took part in public life, presiding over ceremonies, attending games, moving among citizens with a presence both approachable and commanding. His face, familiar from statues and coins, seemed to embody Rome's renewed strength. In quieter moments, one can imagine him reflecting upon the path he had travelled, from the narrow streets of his childhood, through exile and danger, through Gaul's forests and rivers, across the Rubicon, into battles that had reshaped the world. Now he stood not as a fugitive or rival, but as the figure upon whom Rome itself depended. The marble of the city gleamed beneath the sun, its forums and temples alive with voices. Veterans settled upon their lands. Provincials felt the justice of new governance. Citizens marked their days with a calendar set aright. Rome, for the first time in many years, felt whole. And yet, beneath the harmony, shadows lingered. Power so great could not fail to stir envy. Authority so vast could not fail to awaken fear. Some senators, once pardoned by Caesar, began to wonder if mercy was not a subtle chain. Some citizens, grateful for his generosity, whispered of whether gratitude itself could become a form of dependence. For Caesar, these shadows may have seemed distant, less pressing than the work of building, reforming, renewing. But in the quiet corners of Rome, in whispered conversations beneath the colonnades, in private meetings behind closed doors, doubt took root. Still, in this moment of renewal, the Republic, or what remained of it, found a kind of peace. Caesar's vision had lifted Rome from turmoil into steadiness, from uncertainty into order. The people, walking through sunlit streets, felt the hum of daily life restored, as though the city itself had taken a deep breath after years of strain. And Caesar, master of Rome, reformer of its laws, visionary of its future, stood at the pinnacle of his power. The city glowed beneath his touch. The provinces grew more tightly bound. The people cheered his name. The Republic, though altered, lived on, and in Caesar's hands, it seemed for a moment as though Rome's destiny might unfold not in destruction, but in harmony. Yet history, like the Tiber, flows onward, carrying both calm waters and hidden currents. For even as Caesar dreamed of order, others dreamed of restoring what they believed had been lost. The marble gleamed, the people rejoiced. The calendar kept its steady time. But the shadows of suspicion were lengthening, waiting for their hour. The marble streets of Rome gleamed with order under Caesar's reforms, but far beyond the Tiber, across the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean, another chapter of his life unfolded, one not only of politics and conquest, but of love, charm, and the delicate weaving of two destinies. Years earlier, amid the turmoil of Egypt's royal court, Caesar had first encountered Cleopatra VII, the young queen whose intelligence and radiance made her as captivating as any monarch of her age. Their meeting had come at a time of crisis, when Cleopatra sought to reclaim her throne from her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Caesar, already master of Rome's armies, had intervened in Egypt's disputes, partly for strategy, partly for necessity. Cleopatra, bold and resourceful, made her way into his presence in a manner that would be remembered for centuries. Some said she was carried through the palace concealed in a rug or linen sack, unrolled before Caesar with sudden grace. Whether truth or legend, the story captures the impression she left. A queen who would not wait for opportunity to find her, but who sought it with daring ingenuity. Between the two, a bond quickly formed, not only of politics, but of personal connection. Cleopatra's wit sparkled in conversation, her presence filled with confidence, her vision for Egypt as ambitious as Caesar's for Rome. To Caesar, accustomed to senators bound by tradition, she must have seemed a revelation, a woman who ruled with authority, who combined beauty with intellect, who carried herself as though destiny were her companion. Their alliance reshaped the balance of Egypt. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra was restored to her throne, sharing rule with her younger brother, but wielding true power in her own hands. In Alexandria, amid golden halls and the fragrance of lotus drifting through palace gardens, their relationship deepened. They dined together under painted ceilings, sailed upon the Nile with music and oars, stirring the waters, spoke late into the night of politics, philosophy, and the weaving of empires. From their union came a child, Ptolemy Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. For Cleopatra, his birth bound Egypt's destiny to Rome's most powerful man. For Caesar, it was both a private joy and a public complication. Rome had never known a ruler who openly acknowledged children with foreign queens. Yet Caesar, ever confident, seemed untroubled by convention. He welcomed the boy, and in doing so, quietly signaled that his life was not confined within the old boundaries of the Republic. When Caesar eventually returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed, her arrival stirring fascination and unease. She came not as a conquered queen, but as an ally, as a partner of Caesar himself. She took residence in one of his villas across the Tiber, bringing with her the perfumes of Egypt, the glitter of exotic fabrics, the presence of attendants who seemed to carry a different world upon their shoulders. To many Romans, her presence was intoxicating and unsettling. The people whispered of her beauty, her influence, her closeness to Caesar. Some marveled at the idea that their leader had joined himself with the Queen of the Nile. Others bristled, fearing that Rome might bend beneath foreign allure. Senators in particular grew uneasy. To them, Caesar already seemed too powerful, too independent of their traditions. With Cleopatra at his side, their fears deepened, as though the Republic itself were being reshaped not only by laws and legions, but by the quiet presence of a queen from abroad. Yet Caesar did not hide their bond. He hosted Cleopatra at banquets, invited her to festivals, treated her not as a shadow, but as a partner. Rome's streets buzzed with gossip, but Caesar moved calmly, unshaken by disapproval. He had faced pirates, dictators, and rivals upon battlefields. The whispers of senators were but another wind to be endured. His personal life, however, was not defined solely by Cleopatra. Caesar had known other loves, other marriages, each shaped by the weave of politics and affection. Yet Cleopatra stood apart. In her presence, he seemed to find both companionship and challenge. Someone whose ambitions matched his own, whose intellect sparked his imagination, whose grace softened the weight of endless responsibility. Meanwhile, his daughter Julia, once married to Pompey, lived only in memory. Her death had broken one of the strongest ties between two great men, and with her passing had come the unraveling of an alliance that ended in civil war. Caesar, though master of Rome, still carried this loss quietly, as though beneath his victories lay the echo of grief. In these years, as Caesar balanced love, family, and the governance of Rome, his life took on a rhythm both public and private. By day, he reformed laws, planned buildings, addressed the Senate. By evening, he dined with friends, walked through gardens scented with roses, listened to musicians play soft notes beneath the stars. Cleopatra's presence added richness to this world, a reminder that power was not only battles and decrees, but also moments of companionship, of laughter shared, of eyes meeting across candlelight. The people of Rome continued to watch, their opinions divided. Some admired the queen, seeing in her a reflection of Rome's global reach, its ability to command alliances that stretched even into the ancient kingdoms of the Nile. Others distrusted her, whispering of sorcery, of influence, of a queen who might one day place herself above Roman tradition. Through it all, Caesar remained steady. He wore his laurel wreath lightly, his steps measured, his voice calm. He did not answer gossip with fury, nor did he shrink from displaying his choices openly. To him, the union with Cleopatra was not scandal, but truth. A part of his life as real as his reforms, his victories, his vision of Rome's destiny. And so, his life in these years became a tapestry of contrasts. The stern debates of the Senate against the soft laughter of Cleopatra's company. The order of reforms set against the unpredictability of love. The weight of a republic transformed, balanced by the lightness of evenings filled with wine, music, and companionship. But in the shadows of the city, whispers continued to gather. Senators who once had bowed to his clemency now spoke privately of fear. His honors multiplied, his titles grew, his power seemed limitless. To them, his relationship with Cleopatra was yet another sign, not of love, but of monarchy, of kingship, of Rome slipping from the hands of many into the grasp of one. Yet, for Caesar, these days were marked less by fear than by fulfillment. He stood at the height of his power, surrounded by reforms, honored by the people, cherished by a queen whose presence added brilliance to his evenings. His vision stretched across Rome and beyond, into provinces and kingdoms, into futures that only he seemed able to imagine. The city glowed in the sunlight, its markets alive with trade, its temples filled with offerings, its streets humming with life. And in the midst of it all, Caesar walked calmly, his cloak brushing against the stones, his eyes carrying both the weight of Rome and the warmth of personal bonds. It was a moment of balance, power and love, duty and companionship. The marble of Rome and the golden light of Egypt intertwined. Yet balance, like the Nile's waters, is ever shifting. The Republic, though outwardly calm, carried within it tensions that would soon rise to the surface. And Caesar, though surrounded by loyalty and affection, was walking ever closer to the edge of a destiny that neither love nor reform could prevent. For now, the evenings glowed with candlelight. Cleopatra's voice mingled with music, and Caesar dreamed of a Rome renewed. But the whispers in the Senate were growing louder, the shadows lengthening, the air thickening with unspoken dread. The Queen remained by his side. The people cheered his name. The city thrived. Yet beyond the marble columns, history prepared its hand. The marble streets of Rome still shone in the sunlight, and the Forum still hummed with voices. Yet beneath the city's steady rhythm, a quiet unease stirred. For though Caesar's reforms brought order and prosperity, his power seemed to grow without end. Each honor the Senate granted him. Some offered freely, others out of fear, placed him further above the rest, until many wondered whether the Republic still lived as it once had, or whether a single man had taken its place. Caesar moved through the city with calm dignity. He wore the laurel crown, the mark of victory, and a purple robe that shimmered in the light, the color long associated with kings. Though he never called himself by that title, the sight unsettled many. For Romans, the very word king carried shadows of tyranny, memories of a monarchy long cast off in the city's earliest days. To them, the Republic was sacred. Its laws, its offices, its balance of power between many hands. And yet here stood Caesar, holding authority for life, shaping laws by his will, walking as though destiny itself had crowned him. Among the people, the mood was different. Citizens cheered him still, grateful for stability after years of war. Farmers had land, veterans had rewards, festivals returned in splendor, markets thrived with goods from across the Mediterranean. To them, Caesar's power was not a threat, but a blessing, a steady hand upon the tiller of the ship of state. But senators, many pardoned by Caesar's mercy, carried unease in their hearts. They gathered in shaded porticos, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward shadows, whispering of what Rome was becoming. Was Caesar merely reforming the Republic, or was he bending it until only his image remained? Even among his friends, doubt took root. Men who had once served at his side, who had accepted his clemency and honors, now wondered if they were not living under a new kind of monarchy. Ambition, pride, and envy blended with genuine fear. Some believed Caesar meant well but simply held too much power for any one man. Others suspected that his generosity masked a hunger for absolute rule. In the Senate, honors continued to accumulate. A golden chair was set for him, his statue raised among the gods, his face minted upon coins. He were given the title Father of the Fatherland, his birthday marked with festivals. These gestures, meant to celebrate him, only deepened suspicion. Each honor seemed another step away from the Republic's traditions. Another reminder that one man now stood where once many had shared authority. Whispers spread through the streets. Would Caesar soon be called king? Some said he desired the title openly. Others insisted he refused it. Stories circulated of festivals where crowns were offered to him, and of how he set them aside with measured grace. Yet the image of a crown touched to his brow lingered in the minds of Romans, unsettling the fragile balance between admiration and fear. Among those who watched most closely was Marcus Junius Brutus. Noble by birth, known for his integrity, Brutus had once fought against Caesar, only to be pardoned and welcomed back into his favor. Caesar trusted him, perhaps even loved him as a son. To Brutus, this mercy was both a gift and a burden. He admired Caesar's greatness, yet felt the weight of the Republic's traditions pressing upon his conscience. Another was Gaius Cassius Longinus, sharper in his discontent, more openly resentful of Caesar's dominance. Cassius had long distrusted men who held too much power, and in Caesar he saw not a reformer, but a monarch in all but name. His words carried urgency, his arguments sharper than the whispers of others. Together, and with others who felt the Republic slipping away, a conspiracy began to take form. It was not yet open, not yet solid, but it lived in the spaces between conversations, in glances exchanged across Senate halls, in the quiet nods of men who dared not speak their thoughts aloud. Caesar perhaps sensed the unease, yet he continued his work, unmoved by fear. He planned campaigns in the east, dreaming of new conquests that would secure Rome's glory for generations. He reformed further laws, spoke often to the people, moved through the streets with calm assurance. To him, the Republic was not dying, but evolving, finding new life through his guidance. In quieter moments, he may have reflected on his journey, from the boy who once fled Sulla's wrath, to the general who conquered Gaul, to the man who crossed the Rubicon, to the master of Rome itself. Perhaps he felt that fate had chosen him, that he could no more step aside than the Tiber could cease its flowing. But fate has many currents, and not all are visible from the riverbank. In the homes of senators, in the shadows of colonnades, in the corners of taverns where men spoke carefully, the whispers grew louder. Words like liberty and tyranny returned to the air. Men recalled the early kings of Rome, their expulsion centuries before, and wondered if the Republic, once proud of its freedom, was drifting back toward the rule of one. To some, the choice seemed clear. Caesar must be stopped, not by debate or law, for those tools no longer held him, but by more direct means. To others, hesitation remained, weighed down by gratitude, by loyalty, by fear of the consequences. Yet even hesitation could not erase the quiet gathering of resolve. The city itself carried the tension. In the Forum, citizens went about their business, unaware of the depth of plots unfolding around them. Merchants sold their wares, children played, priests offered sacrifices at temples where incense curled into the sky. But in the Senate halls, where marble echoed with footsteps, the atmosphere thickened, heavy with secrets, and Caesar, steady as always, walked through it with composure. He did not flinch, did not withdraw into caution. He spoke clearly, planned boldly, lived fully. To the people, he seemed untouchable, a figure above the ordinary storms of politics. To the Senate, he seemed all the more dangerous for that very reason. Thus the stage was set, not with the clash of armies or the roar of crowds, but with whispers in the dark, with suspicion sharpened by envy, with friendship strained by duty, with mercy answered not by gratitude, but by fear. The marble of Rome gleamed in the sunlight. The Tiber flowed quietly beneath its bridges. The calendar kept its steady time, guiding days through festivals and seasons. Outwardly, all was calm. But beneath the calm, history was preparing to speak in sharper tones. The days of March dawned with clear skies. the air carrying the promise of spring. Blossoms appeared upon the trees lining Rome's gardens, and the Tiber reflected a softer light than winter had known. To most citizens, life continued in its familiar rhythm. Markets bustling, children chasing one another across courtyards, priests preparing sacrifices for the season's festivals. Yet in the halls of the Senate, shadows stretched longer than the season allowed. The whispers that had circled for months now drew close to action. A group of senators bound by fear, envy, and a sense of duty to the old republic prepared themselves for a step that could not be undone. Caesar himself seemed unaware, or perhaps unwilling to dwell upon the danger. He moved through the city with calm assurance, attending to matters of law, speaking with citizens, planning new campaigns in the east. His thoughts stretched far beyond Rome's walls, to Parthia, to the lands of Alexander the Great, to conquests that might complete his legacy. But omens lingered in the air, soft and unsettling. Stories tell of strange portents, of statues struck by lightning, of sacrifices revealing ill-favored signs, of murmurs in the marketplace that March carried with it a warning. Soothsayers spoke of caution, advising him to beware the middle of the month. The Ides. Caesar, ever steady, brushed aside these cautions with a smile, answering that danger would come when it must, and that no man could escape the path laid by fate. Cleopatra, still in Rome, surely sensed the unease that rippled through the city. Her presence remained a subject of fascination and suspicion alike, yet her concern for Caesar was personal as well as political. In the evenings, when lamps glowed in her villa across the Tiber, perhaps she urged him to take care, to listen to the warnings that swirled around him. But Caesar, confident in destiny, seemed unshaken. Among his friends there were others who tried to caution him. Mark Antony, his loyal ally, sensed danger but could not pierce the veil of secrecy that cloaked the conspirators' plans. Even Brutus, outwardly calm and loyal, carried in his heart a storm of conflict, torn between gratitude to Caesar and loyalty to the Republic's ideals. The night before the Ides, Caesar is said to have dreamed unsettling dreams. Cleopatra too, or perhaps his wife Calpurnia, spoke of visions, of his statue bleeding, of his body laid low. At dawn, Calpurnia urged him not to go to the Senate that day, her voice filled with dread. Caesar listened, hesitated, and for a moment seemed willing to remain at home. The household stirred with unease, servants moving quietly, the air heavy as though awaiting a storm. Yet fate, once set in motion, rarely yields to caution. Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators yet still trusted by Caesar, arrived to persuade him otherwise. He spoke calmly, reminding Caesar that the Senate awaited him, that to fail to appear would seem weakness, even arrogance. The arguments touched Caesar's sense of duty and pride. At last, he set aside hesitation, donned his cloak, and prepared to leave. The streets of Rome that morning carried the usual hum of life, yet beneath it was a tension almost imperceptible. Citizens went about their errands, but some glanced uneasily toward the Forum, as though they too sensed the weight of the day. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across temples and colonnades, gilding the marble with light that felt sharper than usual. Caesar's litter carried him toward the Senate, its bearers moving steadily through the streets. Around him, soldiers and attendants walked, their armor glinting in the morning light. He He passed temples fragrant with incense, fountains spilling clear water into basins, statues gazing silently upon him. To the people who caught sight of him, he appeared as always, composed, dignified, unshaken. None could have guessed how short his hours had become. At the Senate, the conspirators gathered. They greeted one another with measured smiles, their voices calm, though their hearts raced. Daggers lay hidden beneath their togas, cold against their sides, each step bringing them closer to the moment they had resolved upon. Some hesitated even then, their loyalty and fear wrestling within. Yet the plan had moved beyond words. The Ides of March had arrived. Meanwhile, Caesar entered the Senate chamber, his cloak draped across his shoulders, his face serene. He paused to greet senators, to listen briefly to petitions, his voice calm, his gestures gracious. Around him, the chamber seemed as it always had, marble gleaming, the air faintly cool, the sounds of sandals upon stone. Yet in the hearts of many present, the air throbbed with tension. Soothsayers had warned him, his wife had pleaded with him, friends had hesitated, uneasy. Yet Caesar, who had crossed rivers and conquered nations, who had faced storms and pirates, who had marched unflinching through decades of challenge, entered the chamber as though fate itself could not sway him. The morning light fell through high windows, scattering upon polished floors. Outside, the city continued in its daily rhythm. Merchants crying their wares, children running through alleys, the Tiber flowing steadily beneath its bridges. But within the Senate, time seemed to hold its breath. The Ides of March had come. The Senate chamber glowed with morning light, its marble walls reflecting a quiet brilliance. Outside, Rome carried on as though nothing unusual stirred within. Merchants arranging stalls, children laughing in courtyards, priests tending fires at temples. But within the Curia, the air was heavy, charged with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Julius Caesar entered with calm steps, his cloak draped neatly about his shoulders, his presence commanding without effort. Senators rose to greet him, their expressions carefully composed. Some offered smiles, some bowed slightly, but beneath their gestures, hearts beat with a nervous rhythm, faster than decorum allowed. Hidden beneath folds of white togas, cold steel waited, unseen, yet pulsing with the weight of intent. For Caesar, this day was no different from many before. He had come to hear petitions, to guide discussions, to lend his authority to decisions. His mind still stretched beyond Rome, toward campaigns in the east, toward new victories that might crown his life with final glory. Yet as he moved among his peers, whispers of fate seemed to echo in the stillness. The soothsayer's words returned. Beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia's dreams lingered, filled with dread. Yet Caesar, who had crossed rivers, toppled kings, and faced storms upon distant seas, walked unflinching. To him, destiny was not to be evaded, but embraced. The conspirators gathered closer. Brutus, his friend, his pardoned ally, stood among them, his face calm, his thoughts in turmoil. Cassius, sharper in resolve, carried himself with stern determination. Around them, others shifted into place, their steps deliberate, their voices hushed. Each man carried both fear and conviction, fear of discovery, conviction that this act would restore the Republic. As the proceedings began, Caesar took his seat. The golden chair set for him gleamed faintly in the light, a symbol of the honors that had made him both admired and feared. Senators approached with petitions, their words rehearsed, their movements designed not only to distract but to draw him into position. Caesar listened patiently, his voice measured in reply. Then, with the signal scarcely seen, the moment came. Cloaks shifted, hands moved, and steel flashed in the filtered sunlight. The first strike fell, startling in its swiftness. Caesar, shocked, rose to defend himself, his voice rising in sudden protest. The chamber erupted in chaos, senators pressing in, blades flashing again and again. The marble floor rang with the scrape of sandals, the air filled with cries and gasps. Amid the confusion, Caesar saw faces he had trusted, men he had pardoned, men he had raised to honor, men he had called friends, and among them, Brutus. The sight pierced him more deeply than any blade. Tradition tells us he spoke words of disbelief. Et tu, Brute, though perhaps silence spoke more powerfully than any phrase. The shock of betrayal carried with it a weight heavier than steel. In those final moments, Caesar no longer struggled. He drew his cloak around him with dignity, covering himself as though to shield both body and legacy. He sank at the base of Pompey's statue, a bitter irony. For once, they had been allies, then rivals, and now even in death, their stories intertwined. The chamber fell into silence. Senators stood breathless, their daggers stained, their hearts pounding. The deed was done. Caesar, master of Rome, lay still upon the marble floor. Outside, the city remained unaware. The Tiber flowed quietly beneath its bridges. The markets hummed with life. Incense drifted upward from temple fires. Yet soon, the news would spread like wind through dry fields. Julius Caesar was dead. For the conspirators, there was at first a sense of grim triumph. They believed they had restored the Republic, freed it from the shadow of monarchy. They imagined the people would greet them as saviors, defenders of liberty. But in truth, the city trembled. The people, hearing of Caesar's fall, did not rejoice, but recoiled in grief and fear. They remembered his generosity, his reforms, his victories, the stability he had brought after years of turmoil. To them, the senators had not struck down a tyrant, but the man who had carried Rome's burdens upon his shoulders. In the streets, voices rose in mourning, in confusion, in anger. Citizens gathered in clusters, their faces pale, their words uncertain. Some prayed at temples, others wept openly, others called for vengeance. The calm rhythm of daily life faltered, replaced by the restless thrum of a city shaken to its core. Meanwhile, in the Senate chamber, the conspirators stood uneasily, their daggers still warm, their hearts unsettled. The act, so carefully planned, had been swift, but the aftermath loomed uncertain. They had ended Caesar's life, but in doing so had unleashed forces they could not yet measure. Brutus, noble in intent yet torn in spirit, must have felt the weight of his choice. He had struck not merely at a man, but at a friend, at one who had trusted him, who had offered clemency when others would have chosen revenge. Cassius, more hardened, urged resolve, reminding his companions that the Republic had been saved. Yet even his voice must have carried beneath it the tremor of doubt. The Curia, still echoing with the memory of cries and movement, grew quiet again. Caesar lay motionless, his form covered, his presence now only a memory that would never leave those who stood above him. The marble walls, witness to centuries of debate and law, had now borne witness to the death of Rome's greatest son. The Ides of March had come, and with them the turning of history. The Curia was silent once more. Where moments earlier cries and confusion had filled the air, now stillness settled like a heavy cloak. Julius Caesar lay motionless at the base of Pompey's statue, his cloak drawn around him with dignity, his spirit departed into history. The conspirators stood above him, their daggers lowered, their faces pale with the enormity of what they had done. Outside, Rome continued unaware. The markets bustled, artisans bent over their work, children played in courtyards where the sun warmed the paving stones. Yet soon, whispers began to spread, carried first by messengers and then by witnesses, until the news rushed through the city like fire through dry grass. Caesar is dead. The words, spoken softly at first, grew louder until the streets trembled with the weight of them. Citizens froze in disbelief, then gathered in knots, their voices rising in confusion. Some wept openly, their grief spilling out upon the stones. Others stood silent, as though the world had shifted beneath their feet. Caesar, the man who had marched through Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, pardoned his enemies, and reformed the Republic, gone in a single morning. The conspirators emerged into the open air, believing the people would welcome them as liberators. Their daggers had been raised, they told themselves, not against Rome, but for it, to restore the Republic, to cast off the shadow of kingship. They expected cheers, relief, gratitude. Instead, they were met with silence. Faces turned toward them with suspicion, not admiration. Whispers grew into angry murmurs. Citizens pulled away, their eyes filled not with thanks, but with sorrow and fear. The conspirators, unsettled, withdrew to the safety of the capital, uncertain now of what they had unleashed. Meanwhile, Caesar's body was prepared for burial. His household gathered, loyal attendants moving gently, their hands trembling as they tended the form of the man they had served. Outside, crowds pressed close, demanding to know where their leader lay, eager to see with their own eyes what they could scarcely believe. In the days that followed, the city transformed. Daily life faltered, the hum of markets dimmed, the laughter of children fell quiet. Everywhere, people spoke of Caesar, of his victories, his generosity, his reforms. They remembered the festivals he had restored, the debts he had eased, the land he had given to veterans and the poor. They remembered his mercy, how he had pardoned those who once fought against him. And they remembered the sight of him walking calmly through the forum, speaking with dignity, carrying himself with grace. Now he was gone, and Rome felt adrift. The funeral became the moment when grief rose into something greater. Citizens gathered in the forum, their numbers swelling until the very stones seemed to tremble beneath their weight. The bier was set high, adorned with laurel and purple, his body displayed for all to see. Around him, incense burned, the smoke rising into the clear March sky like prayers carried heavenward. Mark Antony, his ally and friend, stepped forward to speak. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the crowd. He reminded them of Caesar's generosity, of the riches he had brought to Rome, of the lands he had gifted to its people. He lifted Caesar's will, reading aloud how the general had left money to every citizen, gardens for the public, gifts for the city's life beyond his own. Murmurs spread through the crowd, astonishment, gratitude, sorrow. Then Antony lifted Caesar's cloak, the same garment he had drawn around himself in the Senate. Torn and blood-stained, it bore the marks of betrayal. The sight pierced the hearts of the people. Murmurs grew into cries. Cries swelled into shouts, and soon grief became rage. The citizens surged forward, their sorrow igniting into fury. They seized benches, planks, anything of wood, building a great pyre upon which Caesar's body was laid. Flames leapt into the air, their light reflected in countless tear-filled eyes. The smell of burning laurel and cedar drifted through the forum, mingling with the chants and lamentations of the crowd. The conspirators, watching from a distance, realized too late that their deed had not restored the Republic, but unshackled something far more dangerous. The people's grief transformed into unrest. Mobs poured through the streets, seeking the homes of those who had struck the fatal blows. Fires flickered against the night sky, voices roared with anger, and Rome trembled not with celebration of liberty, but with mourning for the man it had lost. Brutus, Cassius, and their companions fled the city, retreating to the provinces, where they hoped to gather strength. Their cause, so carefully reasoned, seemed already undermined by the sorrow of the people. Rome had not cast off Caesar. It clung to his memory all the more fiercely. In the days that followed, the city shifted into mourning. Statues of Caesar were adorned with flowers, his name spoken with reverence in households across the city. Citizens gathered at shrines, whispering prayers for his soul. Veterans wept openly in taverns, remembering their marches beside him. Mothers told their children of the leader who had brought peace to Rome, whose hand had steadied the Republic in times of storm. And through it all his presence lingered, in the marble of new buildings he had begun, in the calendar that marked the days, in the coins that bore his likeness, in the very order of Rome that his vision had shaped. Though he was gone, his shadow stretched long across the city. The forum where his body had burned carried the memory of smoke and lamentation. Citizens who passed through it felt as though they still heard Antony's voice, still saw the torn cloak lifted high, still felt the heat of flames upon their faces. The Tiber, flowing steady as ever, seemed to carry whispers of his name upon its current. Rome had lost its master, its reformer, its visionary. Yet in that loss, it discovered how deeply he had bound himself to its life. The conspirators had sought to cut him from the Republic, but instead they had planted him deeper into its memory, into its very soul. The days lengthened into weeks, spring unfolding with blossoms and warmer winds. But for Rome, the season brought no joy. The city mourned, and in mourning it changed. Loyalties shifted, anger hardened, and the seeds of further conflict were sown. For though Caesar was gone, his legacy lived, in the people's hearts, in the city's stones, in the ambitions of those who would rise to claim his mantle. The Republic, fragile and trembling, stood upon the edge of yet another transformation. And in the quiet of evening, as lamps flickered in Roman homes and the stars spread across the sky, citizens spoke softly to one another, of Caesar's smile, of his steady voice, of the sense of safety his presence had brought. They remembered him not as tyrant, but as protector, not as destroyer, but as builder. Rome was in mourning, and from mourning, history prepared to move forward into a new and uncertain dawn. The fires of Caesar's funeral had long burned out, leaving only ash upon the forum stones. Yet in Rome, His presence remained, as though the smoke itself still lingered, drifting upward into memory. His death had not ended his story, it had only transformed it, weaving him forever into the fabric of history. In the days after the Ides of March, the Republic stood uncertain, its marble temples gleaming beneath a spring sun, even as its foundations trembled. The conspirators, believing themselves saviors, had fled the city, their voices silenced by the grief of the people. The citizens of Rome, instead of rejoicing, clung to Caesar's memory with devotion. They spoke of his generosity, his victories, his reforms. They whispered his name in markets, carried it in songs, etched it upon their hearts. Mark Antony, loyal in life and steadfast in death, carried forward his memory with fierce devotion. His speech at the funeral had stirred Rome into mourning and anger, and in the months that followed, he worked to preserve Caesar's honor. Yet he was not alone. A young man, barely more than a youth, stepped forward to claim his kinship to Caesar. His adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. Quiet in demeanor, but sharp in ambition, Octavian carried Caesar's name into the next chapter of Rome's story. The city, still in mourning, now turned toward the future. Civil war would return, new rivalries would rise, and the Republic itself would dissolve into something new. Yet through it all, Caesar's legacy endured. His vision, his reforms, his very memory became the foundation upon which the empire was built. His calendar guided the seasons. His colonies shaped the provinces. His clemency inspired both gratitude and suspicion, remembered in equal measure. And his name, Caesar, became more than a name. It became a title, a symbol of power, echoed by emperors for centuries to come, carried even beyond Rome into languages and lands that had never seen the Forum's marble. In the quiet reflection of history, Caesar's life appears as both triumph and tragedy. He rose from modest beginnings, endured exile and danger, built alliances, conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and reshaped the Republic. He gave Rome order, generosity, and vision. Yet his very greatness inspired fear, and his life ended not at the hands of foreign enemies, but in the Senate chamber of his own city. And so, his story invites reflection. What does it mean to hold such power? To win the loyalty of legions, the love of the people, the envy of rivals, and to lose it all in a single morning of betrayal? Was Caesar a savior who sought to restore Rome, or an ambitious man who reached too far? Perhaps, as with all great figures, he was both. What cannot be denied is the depth of his mark. Even now, centuries later, his name conjures images of laurel crowns, triumphal processions, and the glow of torches in Rome's streets. His story has been told in marble and ink, in poetry and prose, in the whispers of historians and the songs of common folk. He has become more than man, more than memory. He has become legend. In the stillness of Rome's nights, after the Forum falls silent and the Tiber flows gently beneath the stars, one might imagine Caesar's shadow walking still among the colonnades. His voice, calm and persuasive, carried not in sound, but in the enduring echo of his deeds. His life reminds us that power and fragility walk hand in hand, that greatness often comes with cost, that memory is shaped as much by loss as by victory. The Republic did not survive him. In time, it gave way to empire, to emperors who bore his name, to rulers who claimed his mantle. Yet the Rome they built, with its aqueducts and roads, its laws and culture, carried forward the imprint of his vision. and across centuries, as kingdoms rose and fell, as languages shifted and faiths transformed, the name of Caesar endured. Even today, in distant lands and modern tongues, echoes of it remain. Kaiser, Tsar, words that trace their origin to the man who once walked Rome's marble streets, whose destiny crossed rivers and oceans, whose life ended in betrayal yet began a legacy that time could not erase. And so we leave him here, at the threshold of eternity, his story told in full. From the dusty courtyards of his childhood to the shining marble of his triumphs, from the forests of Gaul to the quiet banks of the Rubicon, from the dagger's strike in the Senate to the eternal glow of his memory, Julius Caesar's life is a tale of ambition, vision, and the inexhaustible complexity of the human heart. The night deepens now, and the city grows quiet. The lamps burn low in Roman homes, the stars shimmer above, and the Tiber flows steady as ever, carrying whispers of history upon its waters. Sleep gently, listener, knowing that the story of Caesar, with all its triumph and sorrow, is safely held within the embrace of time. His rise and fall remind us that even the greatest of lives are but part of the eternal rhythm, flowing onward, like the river itself. May your dreams tonight carry you through marble colonnades and torchlit forums, through quiet gardens scented with roses, through the calm flow of history's endless stream. And may peace, soft as Rome's evening breeze, rest upon you until morning comes.